I was sitting in the waiting room at St. Joseph's Medical Center, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, when the young woman sat down next to me and said, "You don't know who I am, do you?" I looked up. Late 20s, maybe 30. Dark hair pulled back, wearing a nurse's lanyard but not in scrubs. She was studying my face the way people do when they're searching for something familiar. "Should I said. She didn't answer right away. She reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, old and slightly creased at the corners, and set it on the empty chair between us. I hadn't seen that photo in 23 years. I had come to St. Mater's, Joseph's, that Thursday morning for a routine cardiology follow-up, the kind of appointment you make when you're 64 and your doctor starts using words like precautionary and just to be safe. I wasn't worried about my heart. I'd been worrying about it for 23 years, and it was still beating, so I figured it was more stubborn than I was. The waiting room was the usual Thursday morning crowd. An older man with a walker, a woman bouncing a toddler on her knee, two teenagers staring at their phones. I had taken the seat by the window because I always take the seat by the window. Old habit from 31 years as a county sheriff's deputy in Harlan County, Kentucky. You sit where you can see the door. I was reading the same paragraph of a Field and Stream magazine for the fourth time when she sat down. "That photo," she said, pointing to it. "Do you recognize it?" I did. God help me, I did. It was taken in the backyard of our old house on Sycamore Ridge Road, the summer of 1998. My wife Joanna was standing by the garden she'd planted that spring, tomatoes and sunflowers, squinting into the sun and laughing at something I'd said. Next to her, holding a garden hose and looking very serious about the job, was our daughter. 4 years old, red rubber boots, a gap where her front tooth had just come out. I'd taken that picture myself on a disposable camera. I remembered the way the afternoon light had come through the oak tree and made everything gold. "Where did you get this?" My voice came out rougher than I intended. "It was in a box my grandmother kept," the young woman said quietly, "along with a newspaper clipping and a birth certificate." I looked at her then, really looked at her. The shape of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders, the dark eyes that were watching me with something between hope and terror. "Who are you?" I asked, though some part of me had already started to understand. "I think," she said, and her voice was very careful, "that I might be your daughter." My daughter had been 6 years old when she disappeared. August 14th, 2001. A Tuesday. Joanna had taken her to the Harlan County Fair, the one they hold every year at the end of summer with the Ferris wheel and the funnel cake and the livestock judging. I was supposed to meet them there after my shift. I got delayed by a fender bender out on Route 119, called Joanna to let her know I'd be an hour late, and she said fine, they'd be at the petting zoo. When I got to the fairgrounds at 6:30, Joanna was standing near the entrance with 2 sheriff's deputies. I recognized in a look on her face I had never seen before and never wanted to see again. She'd turned her back for maybe 2 minutes to pay for lemonade. Our daughter had been right there, and then she wasn't. The investigation consumed the next 3 years of my life. I took personal leave from the department to work the case myself, which my sheriff allowed because he was a decent man and also because he knew I wasn't going to stop regardless. We followed every lead, registered sex offenders within a 100-mile radius, footage from the fairground cameras, grainy and useless, a witness who thought she'd seen a little girl with a woman near the parking lot, but the description was vague enough to fit 10,000 people. Joanna stopped sleeping, started attending a support group for parents of missing children over in Middlesboro. She never stopped believing our daughter was out there somewhere. That belief was the only thing keeping her vertical some days, and I knew it, and I kept my own doubts to myself. The case went cold in 2004. Our marriage didn't survive 2006. Not because we stopped loving each other, we just stopped being able to look at each other without seeing everything we'd lost. Joanna moved to Lexington to be closer to her sister. I stayed in Harlan County because I didn't know how to be anywhere else. We talked on the phone sometimes, especially around August, especially around our daughter's birthday in March. But talking was hard. Silence was harder. I retired from the department in 2018. Started doing occasional work for a bail bondsman out of Corbin just to have something to do with my hands and my brain. My doctor told me last spring that my heart had developed an irregular rhythm, nothing critical, but worth monitoring. Hence the cardiology appointments at St. Joseph's. I had not thought about the photo of Joanna in the garden in a very long time, and now a young woman was sitting next to me in a hospital waiting room holding it. Her name, she told me, was Laurel. She'd grown up in Knoxville, Tennessee, raised by a woman named Barbara who had told her from a young age that her parents had died in a car accident when she was a baby. Laurel had believed this her entire life. She'd had a normal childhood, she said, good schools, a stable home. Barbara had been kind to her and she didn't want me to think otherwise. But Barbara had died of cancer 8 months ago, and while Laurel was going through her grandmother's belongings, she found a fireproof lockbox under the bed. Inside was a bundle of documents. Laurel's real birth certificate, not the amended one she'd grown up with, but the original. Her real name, and the name of her biological father. She'd hired a private investigator out of Knoxville who found me in 2 weeks. I almost didn't come, Laurel said. She was holding a photograph now, not looking at me. I didn't know if you were still alive. I didn't know if you'd want to know. Barbara told me my parents were dead. Maybe she thought she was protecting me from something. Maybe she had a reason I don't understand yet. What was in the newspaper clipping? I asked. An article from the Harlan Daily Enterprise, August 2001, about a little girl who went missing from the county fair. My chest was doing something I didn't have good words for. 23 years of a particular kind of grief, the worst kind, the kind that never closes because you never know. And now, here was this woman sitting next to me in a cardiology waiting room with a photograph and a story that was either the miracle I'd stopped letting myself believe in or something else entirely. I need to ask you something, I said carefully. I know, Laurel said. You want a DNA test. I do. She nodded, and something in the steadiness of her expression reminded me of Joanna when she'd made up her mind about something. I already looked into it. There's a lab on Cumberland Avenue that does paternity testing. We could go today if you want. I looked at her, at the photograph, at my own hands, which were not entirely steady. Okay, I said, let's go. The DNA results came back 4 days later. 99.94% probability of biological parentage. I had taken the call sitting in my truck outside a Kroger in Harlan because I hadn't trusted myself to drive afterward, and I'd been right. I sat there for a while with the engine off and the windows fogging up from the cold and tried to get my breathing under control. My daughter was alive. She was 30 years old and living in Knoxville, and she'd found me because her grandmother had kept a lockbox under her bed. I called Joanna before I called anyone else. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always did when it was me, and I said, "Joe, I need to tell you something." And she said, "What happened, Ray?" And I said, "She's alive." Joanna didn't speak for a long time. I could hear her breathing. "Tell me everything," she finally said. Over the next 2 weeks, Laurel and I met 3 more times. Coffee in Harlan, then dinner in Middlesboro when Joanna drove up from Lexington to meet her, then a long Sunday afternoon at my house where Laurel walked through every room, asking quiet questions, and I answered them as honestly as I could. She was careful and measured the way people are when they're trying not to want something too much in case it doesn't work out. But she had Joanna's hands, the same long fingers, the same way of holding a coffee cup. I noticed it the first time and couldn't stop noticing it. She told us about her life in pieces. She'd studied accounting at University of Tennessee, worked for a mid-sized firm in Knoxville for 6 years, recently made senior associate. She had an apartment near Market Square, a rescue dog named Hector, a group of friends she'd had since college. Her life was stable and built and hers. "Did you always wonder?" Joanna asked her at that Sunday dinner, both of them sitting across from me at the kitchen table I'd had for 30 years. "I wondered," Laurel said, "but Barbara was good to me. I didn't want to hurt her by looking, and honestly, I was scared of what I might find." "What made you look after she died?" Laurel was quiet for a moment. "The lockbox. When I found it, I thought maybe she left it for me to find on purpose. like she was giving me permission. That detail broke something loose in me that I hadn't realized was still stuck. We were doing well. We were doing better than I had any right to expect. And then one Thursday evening, 3 weeks after that first hospital waiting room conversation, Laurel called me and asked if she could come by. Her voice was different, tighter. The careful, measured quality was gone. She arrived at my house at 7:30 carrying a leather folder and wouldn't sit down when I offered her the couch. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "About Barbara's estate." I had not thought much about Barbara's estate. Laurel had mentioned that Barbara had owned her house outright and had some savings, but I hadn't asked for details because it wasn't my business. Barbara had a will, Laurel said. She left the house and everything in it to me, but there's a problem. She opened the folder and set a document on the coffee table. There's a second property, a piece of land in Campbell County, about 60 acres in the hills north of La Follette. Barbara bought it in 2003. It's been sitting there for 20 years with no mortgage, fully paid. I looked at the document. A property survey, deed information, current assessed value. 60 acres in Campbell County, I said. It's worth a lot more than it was in 2003, Laurel said. There's been development pressure in that area. Timber rights, natural gas easements. The estate attorney says the current market value is somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million, too, depending on what a buyer wants to do with it. I sat back. Okay, the problem is the title. Laurel pulled out a second document. There's a lien on the property. From 2019. Barbara took out a home equity line of credit using the land as collateral. She borrowed $240,000. What did she use it for? Laurel's expression was careful. That's what I've been trying to figure out. The money went to an LLC called Ridgeline Property Group registered in Delaware. I can't find any public information about who owns it or what it does. My attorney says it looks like a shell company. I was quiet for a moment. 23 years in law enforcement don't go away even after you retire. Who contacted you about this? Laurel hesitated. Laurel, who contacted you about this? A man, she said. He called me 2 weeks after Barbara's funeral, said he was a business partner of Barbara's, that she'd owed him money for a long time, and now that she was gone, the debt passed to her estate. He wants $160,000 before I can clear the lien and sell the property. Did he give you his name? Ray Dooley. He said he was out of Cincinnati. And you believed him? Laurel sat down on the edge of the couch. I didn't know what to believe. I was still trying to figure out who I actually was. And then I found you. And I thought, you were sheriff's deputy for 30 years. Maybe you could help me understand what I'm looking at. I looked at the documents on the coffee table. Then I looked at my daughter, 30 years old, sitting on my couch with her grandmother's folder in her lap, and I thought about all the ways this situation could go wrong. Have you paid him anything? I asked. No, he gave me until the end of the month. I picked up my phone and called a friend of mine named Chuck, who had retired from the Kentucky State Police Financial Crimes Unit 2 years before I retired from the Sheriff's Department. Chuck answered on the third ring, and I told him what I had, and he said, "Give me 48 hours. Chuck called back in 36. Your Ray Dooley out of Cincinnati doesn't exist, he said. Not at that address. Not with that phone number. The LLC is a dead end, registered through a nominee service. No real principals on record. But here's what's interesting. Tell me." The phone number he called your daughter from traces back to a burner purchased at a Walmart in Knoxville 3 weeks ago. I was very still. And here's the other thing, Chuck said. I ran the property. The lien is real. Someone really did file it against that land in 2019. But the lender on record isn't Ridgeline Property Group. That name was added in an amendment filed 6 months ago. The original lender was a private individual. Who? A woman named Barbara Gaines. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stared at it. Barbara Gaines was Laurel's grandmother. Barbara had filed a lien on her own property, and then 6 months ago, someone had amended the lien documents to replace her name with a shell company. And then Barbara died of cancer. And then a man named Ray Dooley, who didn't exist, called Laurel, and told her she owed $160,000 to clear a debt that had never existed. I drove to Laurel's apartment in Knoxville the next morning. She buzzed me up and met me at the door looking like she hadn't slept. "Tell me everything you know about Barbara's last year," I said. We sat at her kitchen table and she talked for 2 hours. Barbara had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in February of the previous year. She declined quickly, the way that particular cancer does. By summer she was in hospice. She died in October. "Did she have anyone helping her?" I asked. "During the illness? Managing her finances, her affairs?" Laurel was quiet for a moment. "She had a neighbor, a man who'd moved in next door maybe 18 months before she got sick. He was helpful. Drove her to appointments, helped with groceries. She seemed to trust him. Do you know his name?" She called him Tommy. I met him twice. 40s maybe. Very friendly. I remember thinking he seemed almost too helpful, but Barbara was grateful and she didn't have much family, so I didn't say anything. "Is he still in the house next door?" Laurel looked at me. "He moved out about 2 weeks after Barbara died." I called Chuck again. It took him 4 days, but what he found clarified everything in the worst possible way. The neighbor, whose real name was not Tommy, anything but who had rented the house next door to Barbara under a false identity, was connected to a small-time fraud operation that had worked 3 similar cases in Tennessee and Kentucky over the previous 5 years. Elderly homeowners, isolated, some form of cognitive decline or serious illness. The helpful neighbor who gained trust, and then, when the time was right, helped himself. In Barbara's case, the fraud was more complicated because Barbara had a secret. She had known, all along, that Laurel was not her biological granddaughter. She had taken custody of Laurel in 2001, quietly, through a private arrangement with a woman who had brought her from Kentucky. The woman had told Barbara that the child's parents had died. Barbara had believed it, or had told herself she believed it, and she had raised Laurel as her own. When Barbara got sick, she started talking. To her hospice nurse, to her priest, to the neighbors she'd come to trust. She told Tommy that she was worried about what would happen to Laurel after she was gone, that there were things Laurel didn't know about her past, that the land in Campbell County had been a kind of safeguard she'd set aside years ago without entirely knowing why. Tommy had listened carefully. He'd found a document Barbara had drafted and never sent, a letter to Harlan County, Kentucky, asking about a missing child case from 2001. He'd seen the lockbox. He hadn't taken it because he knew Barbara might notice it was gone and become suspicious. Instead, he'd spent 4 months learning everything he could about the land, the lien, the estate, and then Barbara died and he'd set his plan in motion. He'd expected Laurel to be alone in this. He hadn't expected her to find me. I spent 3 days going back and forth about what to do. Not because I didn't know the right answer, but because the right answer was going to require me to tell Laurel things about her past that she hadn't asked to know yet. Things about the woman who had taken her in 2001 and what that woman had known and when. It was going to require me to tell Joanna, too, and Joanna had been through enough. But the man who had called himself Ray Dooley was still out there, and he would call Laurel again when she didn't pay. And if he was willing to do this to Barbara, he was capable of escalating. I called the Knox County Sheriff's Office on a Monday morning. I knew the detective who handled financial crimes there, a woman I'd worked with on a case back in 2015. I told her what I had, told her about Chuck's research, told her about the amended lien and the shell company and the burner phone purchased 3 weeks after Barbara's funeral. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I'm going to need everything your contact dug up, and I'm going to need your daughter's cooperation." I told Laurel that night. She took it the way she took most things, quietly and with careful attention to the details. She asked a lot of questions. She didn't cry, at least not in front of me. When I was done explaining, she sat for a long time looking out the window at the street below her apartment. "The woman who brought me to Barbara," she finally said. "Do you know who she was?" "Not yet," I said. "Do you think she took me from the fairground in 2001? I'd been thinking about this for 3 days. "I think it's possible. I think Barbara may not have known the full truth of how you came to her. I think she was a woman who wanted a child, and someone offered her one, and she didn't ask every question she should have asked. That's not absolution. but it's different from malice. Laurel was quiet for a long time. She was good to me, Ray. It was the first time she'd used my name. Not sir, not a careful distance, just my name, and something in me that had been braced since the hospital waiting room finally let go a little. I know she was, I said. The Knox County detective worked fast. Within 10 days, they had identified the man who called himself Tommy. His real name was Leon Marsh, 46 years old, with 2 prior fraud convictions in Georgia and a suspended sentence out of Chattanooga for elder financial exploitation. He'd been operating a version of the same scheme for 8 years, moving between states before anyone connected the dots. He was arrested at a budget motel off I-40 in Jackson, Tennessee, where he'd apparently been waiting to see if Laurel would pay. When they searched his room, they found the prepaid phone with the calls to Laurel still in the history, a laptop with files on 7 other victims, and a printed copy of Barbara's property deed with the assessed value circled in red marker. The district attorney in Knox County charged him with elder financial exploitation, wire fraud, and attempted theft by deception. Because he'd operated across state lines, the federal prosecutor in Knoxville added charges. He was held without bail. The lien was declared fraudulent and removed from the title to the Campbell County property. Laurel was free to sell it whenever she chose. She called me the night she heard. I keep thinking about Barbara, she said. Whether she knew, at the end, whether she understood what he'd been doing. I think she knew enough to put the lockbox where you'd find it, I said. I think she was trying to give you something to hold on to after she was gone. She just didn't know what she was really giving you. Laurel was quiet for a moment. She gave me you. I had to set the phone down for a second. Joanna came up to Knoxville in November, and the 3 of us had Thanksgiving together at Laurel's apartment. Just the 3 of us and Hector the dog, and enough food for 8 people because none of us knew how much to make. It was awkward in the way that completely unprecedented situations are always awkward. We didn't have a language for what we were to each other yet. We just kept passing dishes and refilling glasses and talking carefully around the edges of 23 years. After dinner, Joanna and Laurel sat together on the couch looking at photographs on Joanna's phone, the ones from before 2001 that Joanna had kept organized in albums she'd transferred to digital years ago. I sat across from them in the armchair with Hector on my feet and watched my ex-wife show my daughter the life she should have had, and I didn't try to say anything about it because there wasn't anything to say. Some things you just have to sit with. I visit Laurel about twice a month now. Sometimes I drive up to Knoxville, sometimes she comes down to Harlan. She's been promoted at her firm, senior manager now, and she's thinking about eventually starting her own practice. She sold about 20 acres of the Campbell County property last spring, kept the rest because she said she liked knowing it was there. The criminal case against Leon Marsh is working its way through the federal system. The prosecutor told me it'll likely be 2 more years before trial, given the number of counts and the number of victims. Laurel has agreed to testify. She told me she wants to do it because she's not the only one he did this to, and the others deserve to see him held accountable too. That kind of thinking is her mother's thinking. I recognize it. Joanna and I had coffee together last month in Lexington, the first time we'd been just the 2 of us in probably 15 years. We didn't talk about the years in between or what we both carried, or all the ways things might have been different. We just talked about Laurel, her promotion, her dog, the way she holds her coffee cup. She has your stubbornness, Joanna said. She has your hands, I said. We both looked at our own cups for a while. I retired from bail recovery work in January. My cardiologist says my heart rhythm has actually improved, which he attributes to reduced stress. I suspect he's right, though I couldn't have explained to him 6 months ago what stress was costing me, because I'd been carrying it so long I'd forgotten it had a weight. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from not knowing, worse than the grief that comes from knowing, in some ways, because it has no bottom. You fall through it every day, and there's nothing to push against. I fell through it for 23 years, and I watched Joanna fall through it too, and neither of us was ever the same people we'd been in that backyard on Sycamore Ridge Road, with the tomatoes and the sunflowers and the gap-toothed girl in red rubber boots. But she exists. She grew up and she studied accounting, and she has a dog named Hector, and she holds her coffee cup with her mother's hands, and she drove to Harlan County to find me in a hospital waiting room because her grandmother kept a lockbox under her bed. That's what I think about now in the mornings before the day starts. Not what was taken, what came back.